Okay, so this video represents a new series that I'm working on. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I want to say up front that this will be a two-part video. I'm going to walk you through my line work and the decisions that go behind it in the first video, and then when we get to the second video, that's when I'll address the coloring. Okay, so what I have set up here are 12 boxes that are roughly 2 inches by 2 inches. And my goal for this page is to fill each one of these with an urban sketch that highlights some sort of aspect or technique that I want to work on. Now, for this sketch, I was drawn to the textures and the subtle variations in my reference photo. Now, when doing several drawing studies like this, it really helps if you have some sort of intent going into them. This just gives you something to focus on. Now let's talk a little bit about the pencil sketch that I'm working on right now. You'll notice that I'm not being precise with any of the line work. I'm staying pretty rough at this point, and I do want to stress at this point. I am trying to hold the pencil with a very light grip, and that's just so I'm not making those lines too dark. Now you might notice that I'm going to move that pencil around a lot and draw with different parts of the tip. For example, you might notice that I hold the pencil really far back, and this is just going to help me draw more on the side of the pencil tip to get a lighter line. Now, this technique does help me to stay loose, and it's great for blocking things in. Also, by keeping that grip that far back on my pencil, I mentioned it will prevent me from making my lines too dark, and this is going to allow me to do a couple of things. It allows me to work that line a little more, and then it will also allow me to erase those lines a little easier. Now, you may notice too at times that I'm going to flip that pencil up and draw directly on the tip. When I do this, you'll notice I move my hand closer to the tip as well, and this just gives me a little bit more control with those lines. Now, I do use a little more pressure when I'm working this way, and that's to make those lines slightly darker so they stand out a little more. That way I can see the true line a little better before I move over to the fountain pen. Again, I'm being very careful not to apply too much pressure. I still want to make sure that all of these lines can be erased. Okay, I want to draw your attention to the pipes that I'm working on right now. If you look carefully, you can see that all of those loose lines that I've sketched are kind of making it hard for me to see the form of the smaller pipe. So I'm going to go ahead and erase my line work so I can redraw them. Now, there is no shame in having to erase and start over. You may have noticed that I've already done that at the beginning of the sketch. And I'll continue to do that throughout this phase. I wish I could draw the perfect line the first time, but I can't. In fact, I am very prone to making mistakes, which I'll make another one coming up in the inking phase, and I'll make sure to point that out when I do that. But that brings up another point that I want to talk about. When you're working on a sketch, unless it's a commissioned piece, these drawings are for you. Nobody's going to notice if your lines are off or if things aren't precisely positioned. That's the benefit of being the artist in control. Sure, you want to make sure you're working toward those things, but you get to determine where your lines go. In fact, I often make adjustments in my drawings that aren't represented by the real-world reference. For example, when I move over to the brickwork texture, I'm not going to be trying to draw every individual brick true to scale. I'm just going to draw enough lines to capture the essence of the brickwork. I've said this in previous videos, but when people look at your image, they don't look at your individual lines separately. They look at the entire sketch as a whole. This has the effect to allow mistakes to easily hide into your final sketches, while the overall sketch is allowed to shine through. Okay, you may have noticed I flipped my pencil up and now I'm drawing on the tip. And this is because when I'm working with the window detail here, I want to make sure that I'm more precise with my line work. And this is just going to help me capture the correct depth of these windows. There was a lot of intricacy that I wanted to make sure that I captured. Now, you may notice that at times I will pause with my sketch. I've edited out most of those pauses, but these pauses are me just looking at my reference photo, making sure that I'm keeping things in the correct spot. Now, I constantly double check my positioning, and I try to make sure that I'm getting things close. Unfortunately, and I will point this out a little bit later, but I do make a mistake with this when I kind of move too fast, and I don't really double check my positioning before adding some detail. Okay, before I jump into my fountain pen, you'll see that the last thing I'm going to do is to rough out the guidelines for my brickwork. Basically here, my goal is to just draw all of the lines across my scene in the correct perspective, and this is going to help me add that brickwork in the right perspective when I get to that stage. All right, as you can see, I've moved over to my fountain pen. I am using a Pilot Kakuno fountain pen with a fine tip. I really do like working with this fountain pen because it does have a very smooth flow to the ink, although I will say that I recently replaced the ink cartridge and I'm not seeing as clean of a flow as I have previously. One of my future projects is that I want to start to experiment with different inks. Okay, back to the inking stage. As you can see, I'm going over all of my pencil lines and just drawing them with my fountain pen. Now, this is where I'm making the final decisions of where that line goes. That's why it helps you to go through a refinement stage during your pencil sketch, so you can kind of lock in those lines as much as possible, so you can see those true lines during the inking phase. Now, as I continue to do my line work, you might notice that I'm not always staying true to the pencil sketch, and I think this is one of those tips that I don't hear a lot about, but what's going on is that I'm always double checking my reference photo with my pencil sketch, and I will continue to make adjustments even during my inking phase. So those pencil sketches are literally acting as my first attempt at the line work, and as I mentioned, I'm not perfect, so I'm still going to be off. And when I am, I'm going to adjust my line work to give me a second chance at getting that line work right. But let's be honest, I often get that wrong too. Okay, as I continue to add the detail to the sketch, I want to point out my hand position. You'll notice I like to move my hand around a lot, and this just allows me to approach lines from a much more comfortable and natural angle. There's a lot of straight edges that I'm drawing, and I want to make sure that I'm setting myself up properly to draw those as accurately as I can. Now, since I am recording for YouTube, I am not rotating my paper, which adds an element of difficulty, since instead I have to move my hand around. In fact, I will actually get up out of my seat in order to move my entire body around the page to get my hand at the correct angle. If you're observant enough, you might notice me do that. Now, someone in the comments recently recommended the table that spins with a camera attached. I think that's genius, and maybe one of these days I'll try that. Okay, let's go back to the sketch. Now, another thing that I wanted to point out about working with the fountain pen is that while this produces a nice thin line, there's going to be times during the sketch that I'm going to need an even thinner line. And this is going to be used for much of the detail in the scene, especially the ductwork that I'm working on. So what you'll see me do is use a technique with my fountain pen to draw a thinner line. And that is simply just to flip the fountain pen upside down and use the back side of the tip in order to draw my lines. And when I do this, you'll see that I can get a much finer line. Now, as you watch me draw, start paying attention to when I flip my pen. You'll see that I switch back and forth depending on the thickness of a line that I want to create. Now, one other technique you might see me do to get a thinner line is to draw on the side of my pen. The reason for doing this is that I can control the ink flow a little better, and it's going to prevent any thick, bold lines from coming out. So you'll see me jump back and forth between using the side of my fountain pen and the back of my fountain pen. Okay, as I start to address the windows, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in my head. These windows have a lot of different detail, and it's causing a lot of different depths to show up. For example, the glass is recessed, but then there's these industrial-looking shutters on top, and I really wanted to capture these layers, so I'm going to take my time to make sure that I draw my line work out around these windows. And it's really easy to unintentionally flatten things in your sketches when you move too fast. Okay, as I continue to add details to the windows, I do want to talk about the scale at which I'm drawing. Now, I did mention before that all of these sketches in this series are going to be 2 inches by 2 inches, and that's really not a lot of space to draw detail. So it can make it hard for me to hide mistakes, especially if my lines aren't perfectly straight. Sometimes those will stand out more than normal. Now, one of the tricks that I've picked up when working on commission pieces is that I will often draw my scenes at a larger scale than I need them to be reproduced at. Now, by drawing at a larger scale, many of the mistakes almost disappear in your final image when that size is reduced. It also allows you to capture detail better since you're drawing it at a larger scale. Now, unfortunately, I don't have that luxury of doing that with these sketches, but these thumbnails really aren't meant to be final pieces. The whole purpose of these are to work out my drawings in a smaller, quicker format so that I can see where my issues might pop up and address those when I move over to a larger final format. And additionally, I do want to point out that this allows me to experiment quickly without the risk of ruining my final piece. Other reasons why I really like working with thumbnails is that it can really help me work out relationships and my values on a small scale. I really can't stress enough how important thumbnailing is. I want to tell you a story about when I was first starting out drawing. I would often jump right into the final piece. I was always excited to get into the drawing, and I oftentimes skipped any thumbnailing. Now, unfortunately, I've been burned many times by that. I would foolishly make decisions on the fly that would alter my final product right there on the spot, instead of working them out on a smaller scale. So I've really learned to embrace thumbnailing, and it really does help set you up for success in your final drawings. Okay, coming up here is the mistake that I wanted to mention in the beginning. Right after I get done drawing some detail, I'm going to go right into adding some of these rusted holes on my ductwork without looking up. I edited out a lot of the long pause, but if you look carefully, you'll notice that I hesitate a little, and then I try to attempt to draw the correct holes in the right spot, but realize I'm probably going to make a mess of things if I continue. So I actually just kind of give up and move on. And this really is a great example of why you work out these thumbnails first, so you can see where your mistakes will come out. Okay, now I'm going to continue to add some detail. What I'm doing here is I'm adding some hatch lines to represent the rust or the water stains, and I want to be careful that I don't add too many. One of the things that I know that I'm bad at is that I overdo it, oftentimes on simple detail like this. I do plan on using my markers to help embellish this, and I wanted to make sure that I did apply some of these stains with my pen work in order to exaggerate that contrast. But at the same time, I'm making sure that I'm not getting too heavy-handed with it. Now, going back to the sketch, I am going to move over to the brickwork, and the first thing that you might notice is that I'm using the back side of my pen for pretty much the entire texture. Also, I stated earlier that I'm taking liberties with the texture. I'm not going to draw each brick to size. Instead, I'm going to draw what I hope is a dense enough texture to sell the illusion that these are relatively normal-sized bricks. Also, another technique is that I'm jumping around. For example, I started my line across the top of the windows because that is a very clear perspective line to follow. But once I've established that master line, I can build off of that one to help me stay in perspective. And what I'm left with are these negative spaces over my sketch that I can just now fill with lines. And if needed, I might jump from the bottom to the top just to make sure that I'm matching the perspective. Since the perspective gradually changes over time, I'm going to make sure that I'm very intentional about matching those perspectives. This helps me to gradually change that perspective as I draw out the row of bricks. And really the last part of this drawing is to go through and add the individual marks that represent the bricks. Now, in a previous drawing, I mentioned that I don't like to draw out all of the bricks and that I might only do a concentrated area of brickwork to imply that the entire surface is made up of bricks. However, this particular drawing, I'm approaching it with a different intent. I purposely wanted to draw the texture. As I mentioned from the very beginning, I try to approach each sketch with an intent, with something to focus on. And for this case, I mentioned that my focus is 1, color, but also 2, the texture. So therefore, I am purposely trying to add as many bricks as I can. It definitely is a little tedious, but I really want to see what it looks like when I do this. Okay, that's it. That's the final drawing. Now, because this sketch was a little more refined, it did take a little more time to complete. Now, looking at the final sketch, I am happy with where it's at. So now, the next step is to jump into coloring, which we'll do in the next video. If you enjoy these types of videos, please let me know in the comments, and if you already haven't, please give this video a like and subscribe.